It's not often that I pay homage to a piece of decommissioned equipment, video equipment of mine, but I'll make an exception. It'll probably be the only time that I do that. And I'm talking about my trusty Sony X3000 camera. This is the camera that you might have seen on my helmet as a helmet camera. This camera has been with me since 2016, so this video is for those guys that are interested in a bit of the backstory behind the scenes and how I do my videos and sort of the history, I guess, of the channel and this particular camera, why I still think this is going to be the greatest piece of video equipment I've ever owned. So if you're interested in these things, stay tuned. What's up, my biker friend? Welcome back to a maybe slightly different video, a bit of behind the scenes, and where I talk about video equipment that's very dear to my heart. I'm talking about the Sony X3000 camera. This is the camera that you see on my helmet in the videos. And I want to give you a bit of a backstory and tell you why I still use this camera. Now, the Sony X3000, that's a relatively old camera by today's standard. It came out in 2016. To kind of give you a reference point, GoPro came out with the Hero 5, I think it was, in 2016. So they're out with the Hero 13 at the moment. So it's an old camera. When you think about the sort of cycles that the action cameras go through every 2 years, there's usually a new camera, sometimes even every year, where they have sort of incremental improvements. So when the Sony camera came out in 2016, it was the first 4K camera that had image stabilization. Now, other cameras did 4K, but they didn't have proper image stabilization. The digital image stabilization that we see nowadays on cameras was still in its infancy. It wasn't very good. So the optical or mechanical stabilization was still the best thing that you could buy at the time. Also, what Sony did different is that they have a very different form factor. That was still in a time where I guess the market was still trying to find what the best sort of form factor for action cameras is. We know that now today. It is the sort of square, the square form factor that the GoPros or the DJI actions have. Now, Sony, when they came out with this camera, which looked more like a camcorder, when you think about what camcorders look, it looks beaten up. Obviously, it has a lot of miles on it. I'll talk about that in a minute. So they came out with a camcorder form factor which was unique. Now, typically that form factor isn't very good for most applications. I don't think it's very good for most applications, but there's one application where it really shines in my book, and that's for a helmet camera. So if you know my videos, you've seen me with that side-mounted camera. I'm probably the last person that's still using this camera and a camera like that in particular to actually record video, because the camera is so old. The reason why I still kept it around is it is astonishingly good considering how old it is. It still holds up quite well with the image quality. And of course, the imaging chips have gotten a little better, so low light performance has improved and the overall sort of noisiness and grain. But considering how old it is, it still holds up pretty well. The image stabilization is actually really good when you use it on a helmet. Now, it can compete with the digital stabilization, especially in sort of high frequency vibration environments, which you have a lot on the motorcycle. So if you mount the camera to your bike, if you want to film a rider from the front and you mount the camera to the back of your bike or mount it anywhere else on your bike, that sort of micro vibrations, it transfers through. So this camera is not very good with the optical stabilization when it comes to eliminating sort of that camera shake. Digital stabilization is much, much better. Where it's really good, though, is in lower light. That's basically where digital stabilization on the modern cameras kind of falls apart, because it needs high frame rates and needs a lot of light in order for the digital stabilization to work. Now with the newer models and sort of better image and processing, they find ways to get rid of that sort of shake that you still see. You still see some DJI Osmo action cameras that have that kind of shake in the picture when it gets dark. But we'll see improvements of that. So for that, the optical image stabilization is better because you don't have that kind of a shake in the picture. But the overall quality of the chip obviously is a few years old. So this optical stabilization it may not be the best, but when you use it on the helmet, it actually works quite well because you don't have a lot of micro shakes in there. Most of it, you basically filter out with your head alone, and there is some shake in it that it takes out, and optical stabilization is just perfect for that. So it's an ideal helmet camera for the setup that it has. Now that's the image stabilization. Of course, that was one key feature which really changed the way action camera footage looked. Before that, it was quite shaky all over the place. And sort of with the Sony and then a little later with the GoPro cameras, you finally had smooth images, and gone were the times where you had shaky footage from action cameras. So that was a very, very important feature. The 4K as well, it was relatively new at the time. It was my first camera, so I figured I'd be future-proof in getting something that has 4K. So I've never actually put out anything less than 4K video, and all the cameras that I got afterwards obviously were 4K cameras. So one of the key features of this camcorder shaped camera is that it's well suited for a side mounted camera. Now, if you've seen footage where people have mounted their GoPros on the side, that's, because of the form factor of the camera, it sticks out quite a bit to the side. So one of the benefits of the Sony camera is that when you do mount it to a helmet, so if you look at it, and you've seen it in my videos, of course, but you see it side mounted, it has a pretty slim profile overall. And especially when you think about where cameras are mounted nowadays with this sort of chin mount up front here with this special mount, it's definitely less obtrusive to have a camera that is mounted to the side. I still prefer it. There's another sort of advantage of having a side-mounted camera is because if you're aiming for a proper point of view shooting, it's at eye level. You can actually set it to eye level, and it makes a huge difference. There's a few centimeters if you put the cameras on top, and there's a few centimeters more. If you have the chin-mounted ones, it's a few centimeters less. Especially mounting it higher than eye level seems to usually come up with a pretty unfortunate angle. I don't like the look and the angle of it. It can work in some occasions, but you don't see very many people actually using that angle because it isn't a very good angle when you look at it. The chin mount is a little better, and it can actually be a preferred angle if you have your camera mounted on the chin, depending on what type of bike you're riding and what kind of footage you're after. So if you have chin mounted cameras, the camera is slightly lower. So if you're looking for a more, bigger perception of speed, the lower you mount the camera to the viewing angle, the more perception of speed you get in your images. So it's really good if you're on the sports bikes, if you're on a naked bike, you lay low down on the tank and it seems like you go on a bit faster than you actually go on, at least what the footage sort of brings across, especially when you mount an ND filter and things like that, where you have that sort of blurry side background. That makes kind of sense. The disadvantage on larger touring bikes or bikes that have windscreens is that it is so low that if you have a normal windscreen or even a taller touring screen, that a better part of your image is covered by the windscreen. So, even if you have a clear windscreen and you can see through it, I find that really disturbing to have an image where I have basically a third or even half of that covered by a windscreen. And usually they're not pretty clean. If I'm touring, it gets pretty dirty. If you have a smoked sort of windscreen, that doesn't look very good. I tried it out. I actually have a chin mount for a camera, and I tried it out quite a few years back just to see what the footage looks like, and was not a fan of it. Now, the disadvantage of a side-mounted camera is that you do have a little bit of the helmet in the frame. So that's not something that everyone is after. And I've had comments on this channel where people said, that doesn't look very cinematic and it doesn't look very good. And I would agree, it's not very good. But if I have to decide between chin mount and having a third of the image covered versus having a little bit of the helmet in the picture, then I prefer that viewing angle. So I have been chasing or looking for other cameras to replace the Sony. For the longest time, I was actually hoping that Sony would bring a successor of this camera, like a X4000 or whatever. And I've waited for years and years and years, and it was pretty obvious that was the last action camera that Sony would design and make. For a while, they still sold it, and it doesn't get sold anymore, but for a while, they still sold it past the 2016 date when it was initially announced. But then Sony retreated completely from the action camera market. They still make the sensors for all the other cameras. I think Sony supplies DJI and GoPro and Insta. I think there's all Sony chips that are in there, but they're not making cameras anymore, which is unfortunate. Now, I can see why, because that form factor is the only application I can think of as a side-mounted helmet application. For everything else, the normal action cameras make a whole lot more sense. And, it's a reason why I have my B camera. My B camera at the moment is a DJI Action 4. I used to have GoPro cameras. I could do another video on the GoPros. There's a reason why I have a DJI camera. But for the B camera, so the B camera for me is the camera that's not on the helmet. It's usually a camera that sort of sits in front of me and films me. Or I can mount the camera somewhere else, where I can mount it at the rear rack of a motorcycle that rides in front of me, so it films me from the front. Or I can use different viewing angles. This is basically what my B camera is for. And the form factor, and of course the newer tech with the better image stabilization, the 10-bit footage and all this is definitely an advantage. So like I said, I have been looking for a long time to replace this camera, and I haven't found anything so far. And there's still a few things that I really, really like about the Sony camera that made it a good camera in the first place, and still puts it ahead of some of the cameras that are out there on the market at the moment. I'll show you in a second what that is. I have a longer video where I talk about the camera setup and the audio setup that I'm using. I can probably link it up here. I'll link it in the description if you're interested in that. But just talking about the camera, there are basically three things that makes this camera stand out over the sort of normal form factor DJI or GoPro cameras at the moment. The three major advantages that the Sony camera has over its sort of square format competitors is the first one is the point of view. We talked about that already. So if you're looking at the camera, this camera is basically at eye level. That's a huge advantage for the camera. We talked about that already. The second advantage is that if you use audio into the action camera, which I do, I actually have a splitter. I have two microphones that I use. One picks up my voice and the other one picks up the engine sounds. I have a splitter that splits the two channels. So the voice goes to the left channel and the engine sound goes to the right channel. And I have sort of a little splitter cable installed before it goes into the camera. And one you can see is already hooked up to the inside of the helmet. That microphone stays in place. The other one I plug in. The good thing about this camera is that it has a 3.5mm jack on the camera. All the new cameras, the Action, the Hero cameras, they need an additional adapter or even a dongle. So the GoPro Hero still use that huge dongle, or the multimedia case where you have an extra case to build around it. That makes it even bulkier if you want to feed audio through a 3.5mm jack. This camera came out with a 3.5mm jack. I still don't know to this day why they can't make action cameras that have a 3.5mm jack in there. If they did this in 2016, I don't understand why they can't do it in 2025. It really escapes me, and why you have to use an adapter. Now, I know there's now microphones out there that use an USB-C adapter, but it's a small amount of microphones. Most microphones still have a 3.5mm adapter. You have the wider choice. Not sure why you have to use an adapter. Makes no sense to me. Huge advantage on the Sony camera. The other advantage, and that's something that when you use it sort of every day, is how quick it is to change a battery on this camera. It's so much faster than it is on the GoPro Hero and on the Action. And depending on how you mount an action camera of the DJI or GoPro Hero action camera, how you mount it, if you have the media cage around it, or how you mount it in your chin mount, it will definitely take longer than it takes to change the battery out on this camera. And I can demonstrate that to you to just kind of see how fast it is. For most other cameras, you may actually probably have to take the helmet off and change the battery out, and remove it from the cage and try to do that. I'll show you how fast it is with the Sony camera. So I'm going to demonstrate really quick how quick it is to take the battery out and put a new battery in when you have the helmet on. You don't have to take it off. So you just open the side, you take the battery out, there's the battery, and it's just as easy to put it back in again and close it up. And there you go. You show me an action camera where you can change the battery that quickly. Now the Sony camera isn't perfect. There's a couple flaws with it. Of course, the image quality isn't quite where all the modern cameras are, but the biggest sort of flaw this camera has, even though it has that 3.5mm audio jack in there, microphone jack, which is great, there is no way to manually adjust the input level. So on a motorcycle, it gets pretty loud with the wind noises and the engine noises, and you have to rely on sort of the automatic sort of sound leveling of the camera. So depending on what microphone you use, you can have instances where your voice or the sound that is going in is basically peaking and it's distorting the signal, and it's pretty bad. And there's no sort of manual way of sort of reducing that. For me, that was a lot of trial and error to get a setup with the splitter and the two microphones I'm using. I don't know why it works. Still to this day, I don't know why it works. But it works when I have both microphones connected, that somehow the sort of noise leveling of or input leveling of the microphone of the camera works, that when I speak into the microphone and when the engine noise is coming through the sort of second channel, that it works. And then in post-processing, I still have to do quite a bit to get the signal clear, but it works. So I would wish they would have introduced this, and there's only a few cameras on the market. I know the DJI action cameras, they can have that adjustment, which is really cool. But these older cameras, they didn't have that. So it's the biggest downfall. Now, when I started using the camera in 2016, this was still a couple of years before I even started this YouTube channel. I didn't really know what to do with the footage. So I started, slapping the camera on and starting to use it in different angles and trying it out. So I have a few clips where it was, in the fall and winter of 2016 when I was using the camera. And then the following year in 2016, I started recording my first trip. I think I went to the Pyrenees Mountains and, recorded some of these things. And I didn't really know what to do with the footage. I think I didn't start the channel, and it wasn't until summer of 2018 where, I used up some of that footage and combined it with other footage to sort of produce my first video. And it's been with me ever since as a trusty helmet camera. So I've estimated probably around 150,000 kilometers since 2016 that the camera has been through all kinds of hot weather, of wet weather. I had a 9-hour downpour on the camera and it still worked after that. I mean, my car to communication unit basically failed in that rain and broke entirely, but the camera was still going strong. So it's amazing what I've sort of taken this camera through, and it's still holding up. It's also been one of my most reliable cameras. I mean, I had issues with the GoPros from the very beginning. I started with a GoPro Hero 7 and I had the 7, 8, 9 and 10. And like most users that have now switched to DJI action cameras, the cameras were pretty unreliable. The earlier ones were, would lose entire sort of video footage. It would still record the sound, but then it would freeze the images and, all kinds of issues. The unreliability of the GoPro cameras was getting better with every version, but I thought with the Hero 10 they had it finally fixed, and I was kind of raving about it, did even a video on it. But then after using it a while, the same problems appeared. Problems when colder temperatures didn't allow me to start the camera, would shut off automatically, things like that. I get really annoying. And even on the DJI Action, I had a couple of cases where the camera was trying to update and it wasn't doing it right. Also, it is pretty easy to switch the different modes from video to photo mode. So if you push the wrong button, it's on the wrong mode. And if you don't know that and just, use the auto start function, you're just snapping photos instead of recording video. This is all stuff that's never happened with the Sony camera. The Sony camera only failed if the battery were too low, so I just had to switch the battery out. But it's been such a reliable camera, pretty robust too. It's got a single button so I can operate it while I'm riding. It's just clicking on the button, it turns on. If I want to check if the camera's running, there's a little red light, so I can check the mirror and see if the camera's running. That's all I need. It's got acoustic feedback, so I know when the camera turns off. I can still hear that even through the sort of earplugs that I'm wearing. So when you look at how much I've used this camera, it is astonishing that it has been so reliable. So what I do now, after I'm retiring this camera, I thought about switching to a newer camera, be very keen to use it. So 10-bit footage, it would help me with the grading. I like the DJI cameras. I use, have had a few of those drones. I had a few of these gimbal cameras. So the DJI lineup of products is actually quite good. And I would like to use a GoPro action camera, but I'm still not quite there yet with the chin-mounted cameras. That would require me to maybe run a lower windshield, which isn't very comfortable on longer distances. Also, the weight distribution of having a camera sort of chin mounted, it just pushes the helmet down. It's doable, but I'm not quite there yet. So the one thing that I could do is basically buy another Sony camera. It had to be used. I actually found one in my neighborhood within 24 hours. There was someone selling his camera in mint condition. So what you see here, 1 second, and what I have been showing is already the new camera. It is white when it comes out of the box. I just kind of spray painted it black. There's another thing that is custom made. That is basically the filter thread here. That's not original. There's a guy off of eBay selling it from Lithuania, I think. I don't know if he still does, as this camera is pretty old, but it allows me to use sort of 37mm standard filters. So it allows me to put ND filters on there or just clear filters. And, I change these out every season, at least once, sometimes twice, because they get dirty or they get little chips from rocks in there. So change them out quite a bit. So I ended up buying the exact same camera again. Also, I have to say that the audio jack, the 3.5mm audio jack, was definitely wearing out. So I had a lot of footage now where I had just crackling noise in it because the contacts weren't that sort of snug anymore. So I was already thinking about this anyway. And if you want to know what broke on the camera, actually I haven't covered that again. It isn't really completely broken. It still records video, records sound, but it has purple ghosting in the image. And I just noticed it one of my first few rides of this year that something was off. And I thought it was the filter, that was something wrong with the filter. But then I did one without a filter and cleaned out the filter. And it's, you can tell it's like a purple ghosting. I don't know what it actually is, what the problem is, but obviously the image quality is sort of not very good anymore. So it's unusable image for me. So it's not like it's completely dead, but it was time to change. So anyway, if I found you found this useful, if you got questions on the setup, again, I'll be using it this season for sure. Not sure what I'm going to do next season, and I'll probably be the only one using a camera like this on the helmet in the motorcycle community. If you know of someone else, point them out to me. If they're still using old tech, but I'm still quite happy with the Sony camera, so it still gets to live on my helmet for this season. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, ride safe and stay awesome.